Hello everyone and welcome to the next review. Today's review is going to be for Capitalism and the Death Drive by Byung-Chul Han. What we call growth today is in fact a tumorous growth, a cancerous proliferation which is disrupting the social organism. These tumours endlessly metastasize and grow with an inexplicable, deadly vitality. At a certain point, this growth is no longer productive but rather destructive. Capitalism passed this point long ago. Its destructive forces cause not only ecological and social catastrophes but also mental collapse. The destructive compulsion to perform combines self-affirmation and self-destruction in one. We optimize ourselves to death. Brutal competition ends in destruction. It produces an emotional coldness and indifference towards others as well as towards one's own self. So I think this might be a good introduction to Han's thinking. Although the book is called Capitalism and the Death Drive, it's more of a general critique of neoliberal capitalism, surveillance and self-alienation and productivity and things like this. It's not just about death. In fact, death is really only central to the very first essay, Capitalism and the Death Drive. This is my first book by Han. It's a collection of essays and interviews from about 2012 to 2020, I think. So for that reason, I would say that some of the essays can be quite time sensitive and maybe not as applicable today. The latest essay was written about COVID in 2020, so it's still quite relevant. And overall, the topics are very general and still highly important to consider. So I was always aware of Han from a friend who recommended his work several times. And it sounds like he might be someone that I read as the years progress. He seems like a kind of a modern day Max Weber. Han seems to be interested in topics such as the restoration of beauty in society, the slow death of ritual, the dominance of the information-based outlook in society as well. All of these different topics. So he's quite a prolific writer. In fact, he has written about 12 books by now, and this is one of them. So as for the first essay then, Capitalism and the Death Drive, the main essay, I found this useful in that I'm quite fascinated by the philosophy of death, the politics of death, the death acceptance movement, and obviously just due to the nature of essay writing, the ideas have to be distilled and you can't really waffle. So for that reason, it's actually a very good introduction to the death-denying outlook that is kind of at the heart of, it can be argued is at the heart of Western capitalist society. The main idea to get across is that we fundamentally accrue capital in order to halt death, and a possible task, of course. We have created this kind of death and life situation in which we are constantly striving. We fear death so much that we're constantly striving against it, and so much so that whereas in the past we would have built great monuments, we are now obsessed with digitization and cryogenics and uploading ourselves to the cloud and things like this. And it's created a kind of a stasis in which we fear death, and yet we must accept death in order to fully live. And that is the main idea of the primary essay. To affirm life means also to affirm death. Life that negates death negates itself. Only a form of life that returns death to life will liberate us from the paradox of undead life. We are too alive to die and too dead to live. A lot of the essays in this collection relate to the impossibility of breaking out of a neoliberal capitalist society. And something I found interesting is that Han writes about, in multiple essays and in different forms, in different ways, about the distinction between positing power and system-preserving power. In positing power, there is overt oppression, violence, inherent violence. The factory workers and the factory owners, in a kind of Marxist conception. In system-preserving power, this is the neoliberal order. We actually self-exploit. We willingly give our data to big tech companies. All the likes, all the sharing. We are actually complicit in the system itself because we feel that we are free. It's seductive capitalism as opposed to oppressive. Han says, out of the oppressed worker, neoliberalism creates a free entrepreneur, the entrepreneur of the self. Today, everyone is a self-exploiting worker in his own enterprise. Everyone's both master and slave. The class struggle has been transformed into an internal struggle against oneself. Those who fail blame themselves and feel ashamed. People see themselves rather than society as the problem. Something I found particularly interesting is Hand's concept of transparency, which relates to, again, it relates to the previous concept of system preserving power, in which we willingly give ourselves over to higher systems. And he talks about the post-privacy ideology that demands complete abandonment of the private sphere in the name of transparency. Han argues that given that an ethic of transparency has taken hold of contemporary society, an ethic of distancing is required. Distancing and opacity, as opposed to, again, willingly giving ourselves to these big tech companies and things like this. It's this idea that transparency sounds like a good thing, and in certain contexts it is. We want to know what people in power are doing, and yet to willingly share everything is actually, it counteracts that. And something I found interesting is that he quotes a writer called George Simmel, who says that it is opacity that keeps relationships alive. And this actually has a lot to recommend it to characteristics of enchantment. Simmel says, the mere fact of absolute knowledge, of having psychologically exhausted everything, sobers us up, even without prior intoxication. It paralyzes the vitality of relations. The fertile depth of relationships senses and honors something even more ultimate behind every ultimate relation. In another essay entitled Jumping Humans, Han critiques the disappearance of the aura in photography, in art, and he challenges this idea that the human always needs to be front and center. This craze of young people jumping up in photos is what he kind of centers his idea around, in which the landscape, the background, is not the focus. The more general point to be made here is that he says that in our society, however, in which things, having all become commodities, must be exhibited in order even to be, exhibition value becomes an absolute value. Everything that rests in itself, stays within itself, ceases to have value. Things only acquire value if they are exhibited and seen. That particular sentence was quite significant to me. In another essay entitled Beauty Lies Yonder in The Foreign, I found quite a few Scrutonian ideas. Today, Europe is an abstract economic structure that steamrollers over the interests of its people. Europe fits neatly into the global. Everywhere, the economic abstraction of Europe creates discontent. Any abstraction leaves out differences. This is what constitutes its violence. That is highly Scrutonian, but also Currian, if you call it that. Globalization thus violently eliminates all regional differences in order to accelerate the circulation of capital and communication. The violence of this universal levelling awakens a longing for identity, and this longing is currently being satisfied mainly by right-wing populist parties. The universal levelling effect of globalization, that is, the total monetization of the world, deprives us of meaning and orientation. The de-sighting violence of globalization awakens a longing for a sight. Another essay that I particularly enjoyed was The Big Rush, about the death of ritual. Han talks about the difference between narrative time and labour time. He says that we are losing those temporal forms that allow us to experience duration. He says that meaning founds duration, whereas labour time is just this falling into a kind of meaningless pattern of existence. We need things that slow us down. Rituals, of course, are the key idea here, but also just living with a greater appreciation of the seasons. And festivals as well, making a break from work just to be free, the festival time. Han's idea of narrative time reminded me quite a lot of the distinction between mythos and logos. Mythos kind of opening up a realm of enchantment and meaning in the fabric or the matrix of logos, so the quantitative, everything that is just the same, the hell of the same. so many ideas here in this collection. And one particular essay that I enjoyed, Hahn critiques, challenges modern art. Jeff Koons in particular, he says, Jeff Koons' art lacks transcendence, which demands distance. It is a consumable immanence of the smooth that itself causes a haptic compulsion. It invites the observer to touch. The sense of touch is the most demystifying of all senses, unlike sight, which is the most magical. The sense of sight keeps a distance, while the sense of touch destroys distance. And Hahn in this essay goes on to talk about how it is veiling, shadow, difference, heterogeneity, that sense of separateness and otherness that is beauty itself. His ideas remind me of Tanizaki in Praise of Shadows, the importance of shadow and shade, the mysteriousness of the hidden. So, while I have praised this book, I will just end on just a couple of negatives that admittedly did make the reading feel a little bit tedious, and sometimes I had my doubts about what Hahn was saying, the way he approaches writing and thinking in general. First of all, the essays are quite repetitive, unfortunately. There's a decent amount of range in terms of ideas, but there will be, for example, 3 essays just on the panopticon, the concept of the panopticon. And on the individual sentence level, on the prose level, Hahn has the tendency to repeat, almost word for word, certain sentences, certain ideas, and that can be a little bit trying at times. Another more nebulous issue that I had with the book is that although I agree with Hahn in many, many cases, and I found a lot to value in the book, I have to say he comes across as quite pretentious sometimes. And this is illustrated by an interview at the back of the book. I've bookmarked this a particular example to really get across what I mean here. In this transcript, an interviewer asks him, "You are thinking about beauty. What are you thinking more specifically?" And Hahn responds, "Thinking consists of the perception of similarities. I often have the experience that I suddenly perceive similarities between events, between a current event and an earlier one, or between things that take place concurrently. I trace these relations." There's meaning there, but the interviewer says, "And what does this mean in the case of beauty?" Hahn has an unfortunate tendency, although the writing is very much readable and enjoyable, does tend to obscure his writing. It's almost obscurantism in certain cases. But in spite of that issue, I would still recommend the book. I will most definitely be reading more of Hahn's work. Till next time.